Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of Viking Lives. Our plan for this series is to bring you the history of the Vikings through a chain of stories of individual men and women.
And we're going to start here today with a god, then move into figures who are partly legendary, part historical. But most of the figures in this series will be real-life people who lived in the light of recorded history. And we'll follow these Vikings as they launch themselves out of Scandinavia into the world beyond, to England, Ireland and Scotland, to France, Spain and Morocco, to the great medieval metropolis of Constantinople, to their colonies in Iceland and Greenland, and to the shores of North America.
And there'll be other Vikings you'll meet, men and women who hardly ever left the remote farms they were born on, who nonetheless saw and did extraordinary things that are still remembered today.
But here, at the beginning of all things, Kári and I are starting with the story of the creator of the Norse world, Odin, the father figure of the tribe of Norse gods known as the Aesir.
Odin is a god with many names. He's known as Allfather, All-Father, the Wise One, the Wish Granter,
Spear Shaker, god of the runes, glad of war, Odin the One-Eyed,
the god of the hanged. In Old English he is called Woden, and Wednesday is named after him.
Odin is said to be one-eyed and long-bearded. He looks like a wanderer. He wears a broad hat and carries a spear like a walking stick. He's a god, but unlike the father god of the Jews, Christians and Muslims, he doesn't exist outside of time.
Odin is mortal. He's going to die at Ragnarok, and he knows it, and his existence is filled with the awful dread of his death that has been foretold to him.
The Genesis story of the Norse cosmos is revealed in two works that have been handed down to us from medieval Iceland, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. And these are the sources we have of all those tales that have entered pop culture of Odin and Thor and Loki. The Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda don't quite click together, but they do overlap in a great many places, and they essentially tell a very similar story. These tales are very old, and they come from a time before the Vikings were Christianized, and both were written down by Christians in the 13th century. So there is a kind of a tension here. It's an epic pagan creation myth that's being put to the page by medieval Christians.
It creates a tension, but it's a good tension. You know, these are people who are interested in the past. They're interested in the gods that existed before Christianity, but they're not sure what to do with this inheritance. Sometimes, they can't possibly approve of these old gods that existed. But maybe that makes them more enjoyable too. Maybe that makes their stories strange and wonderful to them.
For the story of Odin, we're going to be drawing quite heavily on both the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. And I think for both of us, Kári, it's true to say that the gold standard for a translation of the Poetic Edda comes from the pen of Carolyne Larrington.
Carolyne is a world-renowned scholar of Old Norse and Icelandic literature, a leader in the translation of poetry and mythical material from the Viking past. She's a wonderful person in the field, and I've had the pleasure of working with her when I spent some time as a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford.
Kári and I spoke with her at St John's College in Oxford, where Carolyne is Emeritus Professor of Medieval European Literature. Hello, Carolyne.
Hello, Richard. It's great to be here.
What does the word Edda mean? Because we're talking about the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. What is Edda?
The word Edda turns up in the writings of Snorri Sturluson, who was the author of the Prose Edda, or so we think. And we would dearly like to know what he thought he meant by that. Edda means great-grandmother in Icelandic. But that doesn't seem to quite make sense, though maybe we can connect it with an idea of oral tradition as being handed down by anonymous and female transmitters.
Like this is grandma's story, in other words.
Yeah, sort of, I don't want to say old wives' tale because it sounds a bit derogatory, but nevertheless, maybe it is part of a feminized anonymous tradition. But it's also been suggested that Edda is formed on the basis of the Icelandic word kredda, which is the word for the creed, the statement of faith. But nobody really quite knows what it means. I quite like the idea of the great-grandmother telling her stories myself.
The Poetic Edda begins with something called the seeress's prophecy. Who is this seeress, Caroline, and what are we to know about the woman who's telling us this story?
Well, this woman is dead, but she's still able to speak, still able to prophesy. She has existed since before the dawn of time, and she remembers what things were like before the universe was created. It's a place where there was nothing, there's just a kind of yawning void. And then the sons of Bor raised the earth up out of the sea and formed the land out of it. Then the gods turn up, the sons of Bor, who have to get a system of time going, because the sun and the moon and the stars are already there, but wandering about in the sky, and the gods fix them on their courses and say, this is how you should run, this is how time will be measured, this is what day will be, this is what night will be. And then the gods are settling in, they're building temples, they're forging tools, they're building a space in which to live. We can think of it as a kind of huge Viking farm with a temple, because they need to be worshipped in it. We haven't got any humans yet, but in preparation for this. And then the job is done, and they're sitting around playing a Viking board game with golden pieces.
The Prose Edda, though, takes a slightly different version of the creation story.
Like the Poetic Edda, it begins with the grassless, formless void. To the south of the void lay Muspellheimr, the fire realm, burning bright and hot. To the north was the frozen realm of Niflheimr, the world of mist and darkness. Rivers of poison flowed out from a spring in Niflheimr and froze in the cold void. Then hot blasts of wind from below melted the poison ice crust. It dripped down and slowly formed into the first creature, the first frost giant, whose name was Ymir. Ymir was still alone in the void, but as he slept, more giants were created from the sweat from his armpits and feet.
At this time, the Prose Edda says Ymir was nourished by the milk of a primordial cow.
A cow called Othumla, and she starts licking at the ice. And she licks out of the ice a gigantic figure. And so these are the first generation of anthropomorphic figures, and Odin and his brothers, Vili and Vie, belong to the second generation.
Caroline, tell me now about the act of murder that's described in the Prose Edda that allows Odin and his brothers to create the whole world.
Well, they slaughtered Ymir, and they use his body parts to shape the world. So his blood becomes the sea, his bones become the rocks, his eyelashes become the fence that surrounds the home of the gods and men, and his brains become the clouds, which I always think sounds a completely revolting image. I do not like to think about that.
This idea that the world is created by an act of murder and dismemberment from Odin and his brothers, well, that seems really different, doesn't it?
It is quite different, and in that version of the creation story, violence is always present. It's how the world came into being, and it's how the world will end. So, in a sense, it already portends the struggle between the gods and the giants, which really shapes the rest of Norse mythology as it's preserved. So it does sort of bake in the idea of violence as a defining act of what it means to act in the world.
So how are the first humans created in this story?
So some of the gods, including Odin and Loki, are wandering along the seashore one day and they see 2 logs of wood and they decide to shape them into figures. They give them breath, they give them colouring so that they have recognisable faces, and they give them life. One is an ash log, and so the first man is called Asker, and the female figure is said to be Embla, which is a word that seems very much like elm.
Yeah, it sticks in the memory that all humans are children of ash and elm, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's a defining metaphor in Old Norse for humans. Humans are trees. A warrior is an apple tree of weapons, or a woman is an elm tree of gold because she's wearing jewellery. And so there's a kind of tree-ness about humans.
The biggest tree of all in Norse mythology is Yggdrasil, the world tree, the massive ash tree that stands at the centre of the universe.
The tree is sometimes said to be the axis around which the world spins. It's the huge central pillar, and there's an eagle that sits at the top of the tree, and perched between the eyes of the eagle is a hawk. And there's the squirrel Ratatoskr, a wonderfully alliterative name, runs up and down the tree, and he brings news from the bottom to the eagle at the top. There are wells at the bottom of it and lakes as well, and the rivers of the world spring out from that.
Under the branches of Yggdrasil is the walled city of Asgard, the home of the gods, the Aesir. Caroline, how are we to imagine Asgard? Are we to see it as some kind of great big walled city, or as some kind of gigantic never-ending feasting hall, or something else?
Well, Asgard is really a huge territory in which the gods have their own individual halls. But the most famous building of them all is the Hall of Valhalla, which is Odin's particular pet project. And that is huge. It has 550 doors, and 800 men can march through them abreast. I think this is possibly slightly exaggerated. But nevertheless, if all of the warrior dead are to be accommodated in Valhalla, which is where they go after death and spend their time fighting, practicing for Ragnarok, when they will try but signally fail to avert the fate of the gods, then you have to have a big hall to accommodate this huge band of dead warriors.
Now, Odin is all-seeing and all-knowing about everything that's going on in the world, and that's because of the 2 ravens that sit on his shoulder. Tell me about these ravens.
Well, they're called Hugin and Munin, names which mean something like thought and memory. And they fly out every day across the world, and they return bringing him news. But he's always concerned when they're away, lest they don't come back. And he fears for Hugin, but he fears more for Munin, if I remember correctly.
Why is that?
Well, if you lose memory, you're losing a great deal. So if he had to lose one, it might be the raven that signifies thought.
Odin is known as the One-Eyed God. Tell me how he loses one eye.
He has pledged his eye in the well of Mimir.
What's the well of Mimir?
So at the beginning, or very early in divine time, Mimir and his brother Heinir were sent as hostages to the Vanir, who were a rival group of deities. There had been a war between the Aesir and the Vanir, and this is part of a kind of peacekeeping process. Mimir is very wise, but Heinir, whose name means chicken, is not particularly wise, and whenever he's asked for his opinion, he says, "Let others decide." And the Vanir find this so irritating that they behead Mimir, which is slightly odd. I think it makes more sense to kill the chicken. And they send Heinir back to the Aesir with the head of his colleague Mimir. And Odin smears this head with preservative herbs and sinks it in a well under Yggdrasil.
And now he can consult Mimir for advice.
One day Odin came to the well and asked to drink from it. But Mimir demanded that Odin sacrifice an eye to the well. Odin didn't hesitate. He wrenched out his eye and plopped it in the water. Then he filled the gutlet horn and drank deeply. And that was the price of wisdom. To see everything, Odin had to lose an eye.
Wisdom is Odin's particular territory. He is the god of wisdom. He endows people with wisdom, but his main mission is to go about collecting wisdom. And at one point he hangs himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights without being refreshed with food or drink. And this gives him the secret of the runes, the alphabetical writing system of the early Scandinavians. And they seem to somehow rise up from the earth beneath the tree because he leans down to pluck them up. And once he has the runes, then he shares them among gods, men, elves, all the tribes.
So Odin hangs himself from a tree for 9 days to get the secret of written language. And this is the really bizarre thing. In the Poetic Edda, it says that he makes a sacrifice of himself to himself. This suggests that knowledge is precious and the price for it is agonizing.
Well, in a sense, maybe Odin sacrificed himself to himself and went through that agony to win this knowledge for everybody else. So he hanged himself so you don't have to. He's got the runes now. What knowledge you have, what wisdom you've acquired, you can now preserve. And that's the important thing about written language, is you can write this stuff down.
Odin's wife's name is Frigg. Like her husband, she is extremely wise and has the gift of prophecy.
Odin and Frigg had a son named Thor.
Thor is the god of the skies. He commands the lashing rain and the thunder that crashes through the storm.
Then there's Loki, the god of mischief.
Also known as the source of all lies and the disgrace of all gods and men. Loki is a trickster, a shape changer, and is exceedingly sly. He is beautiful to look at, but his nature is treacherous, and he enjoys mischief for its own sake. He is sometimes called Loki Skywalker because he wears shoes that carry him through the air, and he's forever creating problems for the Aesir.
Carolyne, what's Loki's background? What's his lineage?
Loki's lineage looks to be that he has a divine mother and a giant father. And we don't know how this person with this slightly strange ancestry came to be among the gods. And we don't really know, given some of the trouble he causes, why the gods keep him there. But we do know that he and Odin swore blood brotherhood back in the dawn of time. And Odin had sworn that he would never drink if Loki was present without Loki also being offered a drink. And Loki reminds him of this on one occasion where he's been ejected from a feast. And you can see how the gods think it's as well to keep your friends close but your enemies closer, to have Loki where you can see him.
Odin is often described as gloomy and haunted, Carolyne. What haunts him?
It's the knowledge that the end is going to come and he's not going to survive it, and everything will be destroyed around him. But even though the fates seem to dictate this must happen, maybe it's possible that someone knows a different story. Maybe there are things that can be changed.
So Odin's like a man trapped in a story then?
Yeah.
Odin is the god of wisdom, but he's also the god of art and language and poetry. And so one day, he decides to steal this substance called the poet's mead. The poet's mead is like a kind of elixir of art and creativity. The Prose Edda tells us that early on, the gods created a man from their spittle. His name was Kvasir, and Kvasir was the wisest man who ever lived.
Kvasir was so wise, there was no question he could not answer. Then one day, two dwarves, whose names were Deceiver and Screamer, took Kvasir aside and murdered him.
They drew out his blood, and they poured it into a vat, and they mixed the blood with honey. This concoction was fermented into a special mead.
The poet's mead. Whoever drank from it would receive the gift of poetic inspiration.
Then one day, a giant named Gitling and his wife came to visit these two dwarves.
But instead of showing him proper hospitality, the evil dwarves took him out to sea in a rowboat and drowned him. They rowed back to shore, and they told Gitling's wife her husband had drowned at sea. She became inconsolable. The dwarves tired of her wailing and dropped a millstone onto her head. But Gitling had a son named Suttung, and when he learned of the death of his father, he seized the murderous dwarves and strapped them to a rock at low tide. When the waters began to lap at their waists, the dwarves screamed and begged for mercy, and offered to give Suttung the poet's mead in compensation for his father's death. Suttung took the mead and hid it inside a mountain, and set his daughter Gunnlöð to stand guard over it.
The poet's mead remained hidden there inside that mountain, until the day came when Odin was walking through the world disguised as a wandering field hand. He was passing by a farm
when he saw 9 slaves reaping their harvest with scythes. He offered to sharpen their scythes with his whetstone, and when he did, the scythes cut so well that the slaves wanted to buy the whetstone from him. Odin said they could have it, but only at a high price. And so he threw the whetstone into the air, and each slave scrambled to take it from the other, cutting each other's throats until they were all dead. And now there was no one to reap the field. That night Odin stayed in the farmhouse nearby with the giant Bögi, who happened to be Suttung's brother. Bögi complained that he was going broke because all his slaves were dead. Odin, still in disguise, offered to do the work of 9 men if the giant would give him a draught of Suttung's mead. Bögi said the mead wasn't his to give, but he would do his best to help him to get some. Odin, being one of the Aesir, completed the work easily, and he asked Bögi for his reward, and the two went to visit Suttung. Bögi told his brother of the agreement, but Suttung refused to hand over a single drop of the mead. Odin whispered to Bögi that he should try and steal it, and Bögi nodded.
And so Odin went to the mountain where Suttung had stored the poet's mead in 3 great big vats, and a hole was drilled into the mountain rock.
When the drilling was at last completed, Odin turned into a snake and slithered into the hole. Odin crawled inside the mountain where he found Gunnlöð. He slept with her for 3 nights before she gave permission for him to take 3 drinks of the mead. With each gigantic gulp, Odin drained each vat of every last drop. Then he turned himself into an eagle and flew away as quickly as he could. Suttung saw Odin fly off with his mead, and so he too put on his eagle shape to give chase. When the Aesir saw Odin flying fast towards Asgard, with Suttung close behind him, they put out some vats. As he flew over the walls, Odin swooped down and spat out the mead into huge containers. As he did so, Suttung came up so close behind him that Odin blew the last of the mead out of his ass, and it landed in a disgusting mess. This final portion was less precious than the other mead, and became known as the bad poet's mead. Anyone was welcome to it, but few cared to drink.
Carolyne, Odin knows that he's going to meet his doom at Ragnarok when he's devoured by the wolf Fenrir, one of Loki's children. But when we meet Fenrir, he's just a little cub. Tell me how things go wrong for Fenrir.
Well, Fenrir is being reared up in Asgard, or among the gods, and Tyr, the god of justice and law, is responsible for feeding him. But Fenrir is growing and growing and just eating too much. And so they decide they have to get him out of the community, but at the same time they can't leave him running loose. So they go to the dwarves and ask them to forge a magic fetter.
The dwarves forge this fetter, this shackle, from these magic ingredients that are almost impossible to obtain.
The sound of a cat's footstep, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the beard of a woman, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird.
And then they invite Fenrir to a fetter breaking contest, and they put normal iron fetters on him, and Fenrir easily breaks them. But then they pull out this soft, silky looking ribbon-like fetter and say, well, what about this one? And Fenrir can sniff that something is not quite right about this. So he asks one of the gods to put their hands in his mouth as a pledge that if he can't break it, they'll release him. And everybody looks round rather shiftily, I think. And Tyr, who has been Fenrir's friend and caregiver, steps up and puts his hand in the wolf's mouth. And as the fetter is laid around his paws, the shackles tighten. And he realizes he's not going to be able to get out of this, and he struggles. And the gods are clearly not going to release him. And the gods all stood around and laughed, except for Tyr, who lost his hand.
What do you think is the significance of the god Tyr losing his hand like that?
Well, now you have a god of justice and law who only has one hand. And that speaks to the metaphor of justice as being even-handed. And it's something that Loki taunts Tyr with later on, that he is the one-handed god now, joining Odin as the one-eyed god, as a god who's in some way defective.
And what happens to Fenrir after this?
Poor Fenrir is taken off and chained up on an island in a lake, and to add insult to injury, his mouth is propped open with a huge sword, so the spittle runs out and forms a river that runs through the world of humans.
Carolyne, we know this is going to end very badly for the gods and for Odin in particular. But do you get the sense that the gods are engineering their own doom by creating such a giant rage monster in Fenrir?
Well, you kind of wonder whether if Fenrir, they just kept giving him an ox a day for dinner and treated him as a friendly presence, whether this would have happened. But it's the pernicious influence of prophecy, that if you have a prophecy, you can either sideline the prophecy and say, I imagine that's not going to happen, and forget about it. Or you have to go to endless lengths to try and circumvent the prophecy. And if you have Fenrir tied up with the unbreakable fetter, then maybe Ragnarok won't happen because he can't break free and he won't come and destroy the gods. But the unbreakable fetter is only unbreakable for a limited period of time.
were talking before about Odin being someone who's trapped in a story, and the story is Ragnarok, the doom of Odin and the Norse gods. What are the chain of events that are going to bring about this awful apocalypse?
Well, the very first sign might be the death of Balder,
the brightest and most beautiful of the gods.
Balder had been plagued by dreams foretelling his death, and so to protect him, his mother Frigg made every object in the world swear an oath not to harm him. But she neglected to ask the mistletoe, because the mistletoe seemed too harmless to even bother with. And for the moment, Balder felt safe. When the other gods were told that Balder was invulnerable, they began to throw things at him playfully, and laughed as all of them bounced off him harmlessly. But Loki had secretly taken some mistletoe and made a dart from it. And he tricked the blind god Hörður to throw the dart at Baldur. And Baldur fell down dead and went into the underworld, the province of Loki's sad daughter Hel.
Balder is Odin's son. So, Caroline, what do he and all the other gods do when poor Balder falls down dead in front of them?
They all weep and fall silent. And Odin weeps most of all, not just because it's his son, but because he knows that this is the beginning of the chain reaction that will lead to Ragnarok. So Frigg promises all her love and favour, she says, to one of the heroes if he'll ride down to the world of the dead and find out what needs to be done to get Balder back again.
And so Hermóður, the messenger of Frigg, goes down to Hel to see if Balder can be recovered by. And Hel says, yes, if everything will weep for Balder, then he can return to the land of the living. But when all things are asked to weep Balder out of Hel, there's one exception, and that's an old giantess living in a cave who is called Thurk, whose name means thanks. And when Frigg comes to her and says, will you weep him out of Hel? She says no. And people say that this was Loki. So Loki has put Balder in the domain of death and is keeping him there.
The next step towards Ragnarok is Loki's quarrel with the gods. How does he engineer that?
Loki has been in a big feast of the gods and has been ejected for killing one of the servants. But he comes back in and he denounces the gods, calls each one of them out, talks about their failings or their shameful things that they've done. And at the end, Thor turns up and ejects him very forcibly. And after that, the gods go looking for him because of his role in the death of Balder. And the gods capture him, and then he's bound with the guts of his son to a sharp rock. And one of the giant women hangs a serpent over his face, and the serpent drips venom into his eyes. And Loki's wife Sigyn stays by his side with a bowl to catch the poison, but every now and again she has to go and empty it. And that's when Loki rides, and this is the cause of earthquakes.
Ragnarok will be heralded by 3 summerless winters. Brothers will kill brothers, and there will be no kinship in the world.
People fight each other. There's incest, there's oath-breaking, there's destruction. It's a wind age, a wolf age, says the poem.
The world tree Yggdrasil shivers, and then Loki breaks loose from his cave.
And he leads the fire giants who advance from the south. And the dead come on the ship Naglfar, which is made of the nails of dead men.
Then the earth begins to sink into the sea.
The wolves who pursue the sun and the moon across the sky finally catch up with them and devour them. The world goes dark.
The stars wink out one by one.
The sea boils up.
carrying the mythic serpent onto the shore, who will thrash about, spraying its putrid venom into the skies and the sea. Earthquakes will course through the ground and smash the fetter of the Fenrir wolf, who will have grown as big as the earth. The wolf monster will want vengeance against the Aesir who bound him into captivity for so long. Odin and Thor don their shining helmets and suits of ringmail and fly forward into the attack. The Fenrir wolf comes trotting into battle with a heavy gait, his dripping maw gaping so wide that the top of his snout will touch the heavens and the lower jaw will drag on the earth. Odin will charge at Fenrir with his spear, but Fenrir will simply engulf him with a single bite. And that will be the death that Odin has so long foreseen and dreaded.
And then the Midgard serpent and Thor fight each other. The Midgard serpent spits poison over him. Thor kills the serpent, but as he turns from it, he staggers back 9 paces and then dies from the poison that has entered his system. Loki and Heimdallr, the watchman of the gods, fight one another, and they both, it's assumed, die as well. And so there's nothing left.
What's the earth like now?
It's gone. It's gone back under the sea.
Under the sea and back into the void again.
Yeah. But then it rises up. It's new, it's green, it's beautiful. And a second generation of gods, the children of Thor, they now dwell in a hall that is thatched with golden roof tiles. It's all very beautiful and luminous, and in the meadow they find the golden gaming pieces that they lost right back at the beginning of time. And an eagle flies across a waterfall hunting for fish. And it seems as if the earth is renewed and beautiful. But we also hear in the very last lines of the Ceres' prophecy that the dragon Nidhöggr, the one who lived under the world tree and was gnawing at its roots, is seen flying across the sky with corpses in his wings. And I'm never quite sure whether Nidhöggr is kind of obligingly tidying up after the great conflagration of Ragnarök, or whether, as I rather suspect, it's a sign that the forces of destruction and entropy are present in this new world as well. I'm more optimistic. I think the gods may have learnt something from their experience, that the younger generation is not going to make the same mistakes as the older generation. They probably will make different mistakes, but I don't think they're necessarily locked into this fatal pattern.
I don't know, Caroline. Everything you've told me so far indicates that the Norse were very conscious that we lived in a cracked mirror of a world, that because humans are made of crooked timber, the gods probably are as well, and that they are likely doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, maybe that's true. Maybe folly and greed and short-sightedness will have the same effects. But I don't think it'll be exactly the same. I think the narratives will be different. But they probably will end up in Ragnarök all over again.
Caroline, I find Odin to be the most attractive of all the figures in Norse mythology. Firstly, because he's the heroic bringer of knowledge and wisdom and information. He's the god of creativity. And also because he's got a kind of endearing sadness about him. He's melancholic. How do you feel about Odin?
When people ask me who my favourite god is, I always say Odin. And I think it's to do with his interest in wisdom and knowledge, this questing in the worlds of the gods and men to find out stuff. But we should also remember that he's the god of poetry as well, and that he provides inspiration to the greatest Icelandic poets. There's a double-edged sword in his provision of poetry. Poetry is made out of loss, sorrow, grief, as well as out of triumph in battle. And that resignation that the end is going to have to come, but is there a way that we can stave it off? Seems to me very emblematic of human experience more generally, that we all know that we're going to die one day. But what can we do to prevent that day being tomorrow? How can we make life longer for us? And how can we make it worth living? And I think maybe Odin speaks to us about that.
Next time on Viking Lives, Kári has the story of a semi-mythic Viking woman, revered and admired by the Vikings for her willingness to pay the highest price imaginable for her revenge. This episode of Viking Lives was made on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples, written and produced by Kári Gislason and me, Richard Feidler, music created by me as well. The production manager and brewer of the Poet's Mead is Miles Maguire. Huge thanks to Carolyne Larrington at St John's College, Oxford. Our website is vikinglivespodcast.com. Thanks for listening.